the prevention of what they regard as wicked on the other side is more important even than the continued existence of the human race, and that is fanatical. And it is that fanaticism which is threatening us all, a fanaticism which exists on both sides.
What's your definition of toleration?
Toleration consists, it varies according to what direction you're thinking. Toleration of opinion, if it's really full-blown, consists in not punishing any kind of opinion as long as it doesn't issue in some kind of criminal action. And toleration of opinion is the first form of toleration that arises.
Well, can you give some illustrations of periods in history which have been tolerant?
Yes, and it really does begin with the end of the 30 Years' War. It didn't begin in England till a little later because we were in the middle of our civil war at that time. But it began very soon after that. And the first really tolerant state was Holland. All the leading intellects of the 17th century at some period of their lives had to take refuge in Holland. And if there hadn't been Holland, they'd have been wiped out. The English were no better than other people at that time. There was a parliamentary investigation which decided that Hobbes was very, very wicked, and it was decreed that no work by Hobbes was to be published in England, and it wasn't until a long, long time.
Would you say that ancient Athens was a tolerant state?
It was more or less tolerant. It was more tolerant than modern states were until the 18th century, but it was not, of course, completely tolerant. Everybody knows about Socrates being put to death, and apart from him there were other people. Anaxagoras had to fly. Aristotle had to fly after the death of Alexander. They were not wholly tolerant by any means.
But how is one to know when one's got to a tolerant period? I mean, how does one recognize this?
Oh, you recognize it by the liberal freedoms. Free press, free thought, free propaganda, freedom to read what you like, freedom to have whatever religion you like or lack of religion.
But now pretty well in the West this exists today, and yet you were saying just now that we've never been in a period where there was more fanaticism.
Well, I don't think it's true that it exists. Take, for instance, what they did in America, which was to go through all public libraries, and any book that gave any information about Russia was destroyed. And you can't call that exactly tolerant.
If you're not enthusiastic, you don't get things done. But if you're over-enthusiastic, you run the danger of becoming fanatical. Well, now, how do you make certain that what you're doing is all right and that you haven't become in a fanatical state?
Certainty is not ascertainable, but what you can do, I think, is this. You can make it a principle that you will only act upon what you think is probably true. If it would be utterly disastrous if you were mistaken, then it is better to withhold action. I should apply that, for instance, to burning people at the stake. I think if the received theology of the ages of persecution had been completely true, it would have been a good act to burn heretics at the stake. But if there's the slightest little chance that it's not true, then you're doing a bad thing. And so I think that's the sort of principle on which you've got to go.
Would this apply to political parties and governments?
Oh, certainly it would. Everybody who belongs to a political party thinks the other party's in the wrong. But he wouldn't say, therefore, you have a right to go and assassinate them. There are certain things you may do when you think a party's in the wrong, and certain things you mayn't.
Well, what do you think of the limits of toleration? You can get into a situation where you have complete license and chaos.
Well, the general principle there is that people should be allowed to advocate any change in the law that they like. But in general, though I don't say this always by any means, in general, you should not permit the agitation for a definitely illegal action prior to a change in the law. You may advocate a change in the law, but you shouldn't advocate an act which is illegal while the law stands as it is. I don't say this as an absolute principle, but usually